Welcome, everybody, to the Old Time Boxing Show on the Grueling Truth Sports Network. The Old Time Boxing Show is brought to you by, of course, the Retired Boxers Foundation and MyBookie.ag. So if you want to bet the Super Bowl this weekend or any of the fights coming up, make sure you go to thegruelingtruth.net, click on the MyBookie.ag banner. It'll take you directly there where you can get a 50% cashback bonus up to $3,000. I'm your host for the Old Time Boxing Show, Mike Goodpaster. Right now, I want to introduce the Grueling Truth's boxing historian, Christopher Shelton. How you doing, Christopher?
Good to have my voice. There's a lot of flu going around, so I'm trying to avoid it and just keep my voice in check.
All right, and today we're going to go back in time about 100 years to the life and career of Jack Dempsey, who was born, of course, William Harrison Dempsey in Manassas, Colorado. Grew up in a poor family, moved around a little bit, and I think the big thing about him is we don't really have a complete record of him because a lot of his fights, he would occasionally visit saloons before he became a boxer and challenge people for fights. And I think the quote was there, "I can't sing and dance, but I can lick any son of a bitch in the house, and if anyone accepted the challenge, bets would be made." According to Dempsey's autobiography, which you never know if you can trust that or not, he very rarely lost these brawls. He was also a bodyguard for Thomas Kearns, president of the Salt Lake Tribune, for a while. So he had a really interesting life, and as most boxers, grew up downtrodden, poor, and had to fight his way out of it.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that you say that, and I think it's totally true about Dempsey, that we know very little in some ways about the early part of his career. We know he's knocked out by Fireman Jim Flynn in the first round. Whether Fireman Flynn was cheating or not, who knows? But we don't know much about his early career. But what we do know is once he sort of picked up his fame and was famous for celebrities, it was these early round knockouts and this way that he was a brawler in a way that we got used to boxing being about 20 to 45 rounds of wrestling, and they were mostly not really throwing punches. And Dempsey came in throwing punches, and that was extraordinarily exciting to the public.
Yeah, and the reason I don't want to talk too much about this part is because I don't think of autobiographies out there that a lot of them hold a lot of water. A lot of them went off of Dempsey's recollections from 40 years before. And the thing I found is the only book I found that I really thought was close to the truth would have been written in 1977, and that was because it's the only book that really brought up A.J. Arbach, who discovered him in 1914. He's the one that started him with his professional boxing career. Do you know anything about Arbach?
I don't. All I can tell you is just before he fought Willard that he had about 7 or 8 fights in a row that went about 2 rounds, and he started getting the attention of Hollywood celebrities, and that's where his fame started kicking in. But I don't know about who you're talking about in particular.
Oh, man, I thought you did some research here, Christopher. You're supposed to be my boxing
I do research, but I do research where I watch the fights, and I watch why he became popular, and I see why he became popular, because these guys were wrestling and not really boxing and fighting or throwing. They weren't doing anything, and Dempsey came in from the first round, like you see Tyson, and he's throwing punches right away, and I see that's why his popularity kicked in.
Yeah, and of course, the fight that sticks out when you look at his record is February 13th, 1917, where he was knocked out at 25 seconds of round 1 by fireman Jim Flynn. And there's a lot of stories. I've read a lot that says that the fight was fixed. I've read a lot that Dempsey said that he was hurt, and that's why, because he had a badly injured right hand, which occurred when he dropped a ball on it in a bowling alley, from what I read. What do you think is the closest thing to the truth here?
I think the closest thing to the truth is that Flynn has given himself such a disreputable sort of, reputation. He's a dishonest guy. We know he fights dishonest because we watch it on film, that you've got to be curious whether there was something in his glove and he was hitting with something or doing something dishonest. And that's because Flynn has shown that on film. So it's not like we're guessing about him by reading about what other people say. We see Flynn cheating over and over against Jack Johnson. I mean, just nonstop cheating. And you got to think, hey, this guy, you got to be suspicious of him. And you don't know how that influences Jack Dempsey. Does Jack Dempsey cheat after that, or was he just cheated on and went from there?
Yeah, and we had Jess Willard was the heavyweight champion at the time. Jess Willard had beaten, a 26-round knockout against Jack Johnson in Havana, Cuba a few years before that. What's your take on Jess Willard?
He's a big, tough circus guy. Killed somebody in the ring, so, he could definitely hit. And at 6'6" and 270 pounds, there's really nobody like him until you start getting to the Riddick Bowe's and Lennox Lewis's. Though there were a couple guys in the 1890s that were pretty big, but he was certainly one of the biggest, strongest guys, and that he was put in the ring specifically against Jack Johnson because of his physical nature. They made it 45 rounds in Havana, Cuba, in the middle of summer, trying to do everything they can to give Jack Johnson a disability. And they just felt this guy, no matter what Jack Johnson does to him, he's going to keep getting up. And he's going to keep getting up. And eventually, Jack Johnson, at nearly 40 years old, 37, is going to wear down, and that this guy's going to knock him out. And you see Jack Johnson giving it everything he can to knock Willard out in the 26th round and can't do it. And then Willard finally knocks him out.
Yeah, and the thing that stood out there is you talked about somebody putting something in their gloves. Jack Kearns, Dempsey's manager, years later came out with a confession in 1964 in Sports Illustrated that Dempsey didn't know the gloves were loaded, but Kearns had loaded the gloves.
Yeah, that I don't know. I know there's a lot of claims and things that people say, and as time goes by and stuff like that, I think that, it is what it is. I think Willard, took Johnson out because they kind of made it difficult for Johnson to win. And then there's a lot of questions about whether Dempsey cheated to beat Willard, and there's no proof of it. So I think you ultimately have to just go with what you watch on film, and then you make your own judgment.
So you don't put any validity into Jack Kearns, Dempsey's manager? Because I know that Kearns had bet $10,000 on him to knock him out in the first round at 10-1 odds. So I think something could have happened there, because when you look at Willard, he's a man that had never been knocked down until that fight.
Yep. No, I mean that's exactly. I'm agreeing that, hey, I can't prove anything against Dempsey. Because I can't prove it, I can't say something against him. Though it is pretty unusual that Dempsey's beating him around the plank. Small guy gets the big guy, and that I do think there's a good chance that Flynn cheated against Dempsey, and that you learn from that. You say, look, somebody cheated against me and got away with it. I'm going to cheat. But you can't prove it. All you can prove is, what you see in that exciting first round. That first round is Dempsey knocking Willard all over the place. A small guy knocking a giant all over the place, which is still exciting today. Is it possible there was cheating involved? Absolutely. But you can't prove it, and then I can't hold it against them.
All right, and we talk about that fight a little bit, and that fight was fought at Bayview Park Arena in Toledo, Ohio. Tex Rickard had, I think it was Tex Rickard at the time, had promoted the fight. Yeah. Willard's purse was $100,000. Dempsey's was $27,500. There was a crowd of 19,500, which was less than a quarter of the arena's seating capacity. But I think this is the fight that really brought, of course, Jack Dempsey and boxing to the forefront of American sports, because there had been a downtime. In a lot of states, boxing wasn't even legal anymore. You had Jack Johnson and that mess that happened there from, 1908 to 1915. So I think this was a huge fight for what we have today boxing-wise, because without Dempsey in this fight, who knows what happens to boxing.
No, absolutely. I agree. I agree that this is terrific for boxing, and that what we need now, we want another Jack Dempsey, and that what Jack Dempsey did in that first round against Jess Willard, knocked him down at least 6 times, kept just knocking him down, knocking down this giant man, was riveting to the public, and they got to see the films of this, and it's very exciting because you're only watching a film for about 3 minutes. Now, the fight actually lasted more than 3 rounds before Willard quit, but you almost forget that because Dempsey beat him so senseless in the first round that's the only round you watch, and it was riveting to boxing, and quite frankly, what we need today.
Yeah, and then his first defense, or his first fight after winning a championship, was against Billy Misk, who he knocked out 113 in the third round. This was the first bout that was broadcast on radio to a nationwide audience, and I don't think Misk had been knocked down before. This was the first time. Misk also, the interesting thing is he had Bright's disease, which was an inflammation of the structures in the kidney that produce your urine, and I mean, this was a fight that I think, as you talked about, people look for excitement. It's why Mike Tyson was so big. That's why Jerry Cooney was so big in the early 1980s. Is people coming out and just knocking people out. And the attendance here was 11,000. And I would think at this time, with a guy like, Dempsey, that you got to be looking out there for somebody to have a huge event, which would come a year later.
Yeah, I think again that's what Dempsey brought to the table, and I don't think you've seen anything before him like John L. Sullivan. And John L. Sullivan, you didn't get to see film; you just got to hear about his reputation. While at least with Dempsey, you could actually see this film with Willard, where he keeps knocking him around and getting excited about him. And he amongst athletes or even famous people, there was only really Babe Ruth that was equal to him in approximately 1920, 1921, and it was just because he's bringing out the knockout, and the knockout is very exciting in boxing. It's not the defensive fighter. The defensive fighter might be the real boxer, but it's the knockout artist that excites the crowd.
Yeah, it's the knockout artist in boxing, which you had here with Jack Dempsey. And then later in the 20s, as we go on through the decade, you got, in baseball, it's the home run hitter, which you had in Babe Ruth.
Mm-hmm.
In football, it's the guy that can go to distance anytime he touches the ball, which you had with Red Grange. And, I mean, This was the golden age of sports. And the thing is, these are the three guys that made these three sports popular.
Yeah, and it's really hard to define even in our era because – Babe Ruth was hitting more home runs than other teams. So we're not used to somebody that can hit more home runs by themselves than other teams. And that Jack Dempsey's popularity really isn't anything except Mike Tyson that we can evaluate as far as somebody that this thing comes in there, a blue-collar kind of guy, maybe Chavez in, Mexico, that they just goes in there blue-collar and throws punches and tries to knock out the person right away, though Chavez didn't score early-round knockouts like Tyson did originally, and Dempsey did before really he was champion.
Yeah, and then next up at the end, I think December of 1920, he beats Bill Brennan by a knockout at 157 in round 12. Once again, Madison Square Garden, only 10,000 tickets sold. So Tex Rickard, who was a great promoter, I don't think anybody can debate that, comes up with the idea of fighting light heavyweight champion George Carpentier. They did it at Boyle's, Boyle's 30 acres in Jersey. I think they built a 100,000-seat stadium. Dempsey was guaranteed $300,000, Carpentier $200,000, and I think this was, the first bout promoted as the fight of the century. But the big thing about this is this, and Dempsey was Rickard's guy. He made this fight the hero versus the villain. And they bring up everything about Dempsey being a draft dodger, not fighting in the war. And, of course, Carpentier was a Frenchman who distinguished himself in World War I. And really, they made it so the foreigner was maybe the crowd favorite in this fight.
Yeah, and, that's so unusual for our generation and stuff because for whatever reason, and I don't agree with this, our country seems to hate French people. I don't know why we hate French people, but we seem to hate them. But Carpentier was the hero. He was the likable guy, and I watched the silence, everything to try to gather what people were watching. And he's a funny guy. He's a likable guy. He looks like he could be charming with women and men, and he was. He was the hero, and for whatever reason, Dempsey was the villain, which is very unusual because it was an American fight, but the American was the villain, and the Frenchman was the hero going in and throughout the fight.
Yeah, and the thing that was interesting to me is Carpentier had Joe Giannetti as one of his sparring partners.
Yeah, and the other thing that's interesting to me, because I read, I get these books, the best sports stories of the last 100 years or whatever they are, and stuff like that. That Carpentier really only scored a couple blows in the second round against Dempsey, but somehow those two blows he scored against Dempsey made an impression on not just Americans but the world. Like the underdog had done something so unbelievable, landing these two punches, that even though Dempsey won the fight pretty easily, Carpentier's two punches in the second round defined the fight.
Well, see, those two punches, though, from what I read, Carpentier actually broke his right thumb in two places and had a wrist strain also from those two punches. Maybe that's why he only landed two. But the other interesting thing is it was the first fight that was sanctioned by the National Boxing Association, and the NBA would change its name to the WBA in 1962. So I guess we can blame Dempsey for all this alphabet bullshit, too.
Well, there are a lot of rules changed because of Dempsey. Because Dempsey was, Dempsey was what he was, and they had to watch out for him because he would knock somebody down and they just hover over them. The minute you move your knee, I'm gonna blast you, and so they did have to sort of rewrite things because of Dempsey.
Yeah. Then we've got Tommy Gibbons next, famous fight in Shelby, Montana, which I think a lot of people, I'm pretty sure you know a lot about this. So do you want to tell a little bit about Shelby and what happened with that fight?
I would just say that I think it's a better fight than it's given credit for. Tommy Gibbons was an excellent boxer. His brother Mike, Gene Tunney, said that was his hero. That's who Gene Tunney learned from, was Mike Gibbons, his brother. I actually know the Gibbons family. Jennifer Gibbons, really good-looking girl, tough girl. But the Gibbons family.
Oh my God! With this again, it was Roberto Duran's wife last week. Now it's Gibbons.
These are great.
Whatever.
These are great defensive fighters, and Jack Dempsey was used to mostly facing guys that he thought was going to throw punches at him rather than guys that were going to try to outthink him. And so Gibbons did last the distance. It's questionable whether he got paid or not in Shelby, Montana. But it was a great fight, and that Gibbons gave Dempsey a lot in the defensive department. Dempsey was used to somebody coming at him, and this is somebody not coming at him. This is somebody who's going to outthink him. And maybe, you could even argue he won the fight, but you can't take away Dempsey's crown. You can't take away Babe Ruth from the championship unless a guy knocks him down or knocks him out or does something a little bit more than Tommy Gibbons. But Tommy Gibbons gave him everything in the boxing department that's what makes it boxing and not fighting.
Yeah, and the thing about it is it basically broke the town. Because the town was to pay $300,000 in three separate $100,000 installments. The town paid the first installment without incident, but collecting the other $200,000 for Rickard was an excruciating process. A local banker donated $98,200 at a second installment, but after that, the well run dry, and the fight was actually originally canceled on July 3rd, but was back on when Kearns agreed to take whatever he could from the 100,000 gate receipts. So actually, we could probably do a whole show about this. I've read a lot about that before. But just another interesting thing with Dempsey. And then, of course, after that, you get Dempsey Firpo. And this is just a couple months after Gibbons, which I think is one of the few times that once he became champion, he fought more than once in a year. But over 80,000 people produced a gate of $1.25 million. Dempsey made close to $500,000 for this fight. Firpo was down 7 times in the first round. Dempsey was down twice, and I think one of the most famous pictures in boxing history is Firpo putting Dempsey through the ring, and then the reporters kind of pushing Dempsey back in.
Yeah, knocking him through the ropes and knocking him out of the ring. Knocking Dempsey through the ring. And I grew up, kind of with everything you're saying, the whole Shelby, Montana thing, I'm corrupted a little bit because I grew up a boxing fan before I thought I was going to do this, more serious. And so I hear all these stories, and it's hard to get that out of your head. And the Firpo Dempsey fight was, when I remember reading, the books and stuff, was the best first round in boxing history up to 1950 or something. And Firpo is a big Argentinian guy, and knocked Dempsey down twice and through the ring, and Dempsey knocked him down 6 times. It's an extraordinarily exciting first round. And I guess that's what he does with Dempsey, with both Willard and Firpo. Those first rounds are so exciting. Even now, you can look at those films yourself, and they are incredibly exciting.
Yeah, and after that, I mean, for 3 years, Dempsey doesn't do anything. I think he acted in some movies, went around collecting money, basically.
Yeah.
Promoter Tex
trying
Rickard.
to get.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say he's not trying to get clean cut. Now he doesn't want to be viewed as a thug, a really rough guy. He's trying to show I'm a gentleman, I'm a classy guy. Gets himself a movie starlet, tries to shave and look nice, wear these suits. He's trying to project a different image. Meanwhile, he's not fighting. At least we give Marciano credit. When Marciano stopped fighting, he quit, and that was it. Dempsey's holding on to the crown and not fighting, but he's trying to show I'm not just a thug. I'm a gentleman, and I can get a classic dame just like anybody else.
All right, and promoter Tex Rickard wanted to stage Dempsey versus Tunney at Yankee Stadium on September 16, 1923. However, on August 16, the state licensing committee in New York said they would not grant Dempsey a license until he complied with the New York State Athletic Commission's order to defend against Harry Willis. Now, Harry Wills was a black man who deserved a shot at the title, and Dempsey, for whatever reason, wouldn't give him a shot. So on August the 18th, Rickard announced that Dempsey would fight Tunney in Philadelphia so they could skip having to fight Wills. To me, when you look at Dempsey's career, the biggest drawbacks in his career to me are the fact that he didn't defend his title that much, and he didn't fight Harry Wills or any of the other deserving black challengers.
I agree, and I'm a big Dempsey fan. But yes, you're right. Those are the things you hold against him. Went 3 years not fighting anybody, and then what people perceived as the best black champion at that time, he wouldn't fight him. And I guess you got to hold it against him, and where you put things in your legacy.
Yeah, and this was boxing's third $1 million gate, bringing in almost $2 million. The crowd in Philadelphia was 120,557. It was the largest paid attendance ever for a boxing match, and that record stood for close to 70 years. It was broke, of course, when 132,274 paid to see Julio Cesar Chavez versus Greg Haugen in Mexico City in 1993. The biggest crowd of all time was Tony Zale against Billy Pryor. That was a fight in Milwaukee that drew over 135,000, but that was a free show that was staged for the Fraternal Order of the Eagles and the Pabst Brewing Company. So what if they got free beer, too? Because that's why 135,000 people would have showed up, I would think.
Well, I think everybody shows up for free beer. But, yeah, I think that's Dempsey's legacy that is still important and not maybe noted enough is how much he brought people into boxing, how popular. He made it so popular because when Jack Johnson fought Fireman Flynn Jim in 1912, there was only 5,000 people in Vegas, and you couldn't get a crowd. And meanwhile, Dempsey's bringing in 1 million people. His popularity, along with Babe Ruth, it's hard to describe today because we just don't have that kind of fame today because there's so many different social media and so many different kinds of people that are famous that it's hard to believe that a Babe Ruth or a Lindbergh or a Jack Dempsey have such a control of fame. They're so famous and so popular. There really wasn't anybody like Jack Dempsey before John O'Sullivan.
The big thing here is on the morning of the fight, and I've read this a lot from credible sources. Did you ever hear the story of Mike Trent, Dempsey's bodyguard?
No, go ahead and tell me.
See, once again, I just thought I'd be the boxing historian myself. But Mike Trent was one of Dempsey's bodyguards, and he gave the champion a small glass of olive oil, a habit meant to aid digestion that Dempsey had used in the past. And Dempsey suffered something akin to food poisoning, and rumors spread that gamblers had paid Trent to put something in Dempsey's olive oil. Nothing was ever substantiated. I just think this is an interesting story, especially when it is connected to racketeer Arnold Rothstein, who was also behind the 1919 World Series fix. But Rothstein, who was ringside for the fight, bet 125,000 at 4-1 odds that Tunney would win the fight. So I thought that was interesting. I also, Tex Rickard was freaked out because Gene Tunney had arrived at a fight in an airplane, and he was freaked out he was going to get in a plane. But going into that ring, as they entered the ring that night, it started to rain, which led a little to the ambiance of the moment. But Tunney ended up dominating the fight, winning by an easy 10-round unanimous decision.
Right.
And Tunney's win was the upset of the decade by Ring Magazine. As I said, the odds were 4-1. But I think when you look back at this, it's like when you look back at Super Bowl III and you look at the careers of all those Jets, you wonder how the hell could they have been an 18-point underdog? You look at Tunney and the fact that he beat Harry Greb, that Dempsey, the big thing to me is Dempsey hadn't fought in 3 years, and all of a sudden you're sticking him in the ring with a slick boxer. I don't think when you look back at this in hindsight that it's really that great of an upset.
I agree. I want to throw this out because I know you're a Cincinnati guy. I hope one day you'll do a story of the 1919 Cincinnati Reds, and, hey, did they really need to cheat to win?
No, because the 1919 Cincinnati Reds were a great baseball team, and people forget about it.
They're a great baseball team.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I'm going to say that Tunney absolutely dominated Dempsey. In fact, Dempsey had to change his tactics, which he did the second time, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the first time around, it looked like a guy that had been fighting and doing a great boxer against a guy that hadn't been in the ring for 3 years. Tunney dominated Dempsey. I mean, this is not even a close fight. It's a boxer showing the skills of his boxing versus a guy that's trying to look to throw a punch and can't get it in.
Yeah, and next up, he wants the rematch, so the guy he's got to beat to get the rematch. Basically, they matched Jack Dempsey against Jack Sharkey, Yankee Stadium in the Bronx, New York. 82,000 people showed up for this. And another $1 million gate. But, I mean, I think going into this fight, Sharkey was favored by most. I think what I saw was like 16 out of 25 sports writers picked Sharkey to win. And when you watch this fight, Sharkey dominated the early rounds. And Dempsey admitted afterwards that he thought Sharkey was going to knock him out even.
Sharkey dominated it. You know, it's just one of those things that everyone wanted to see Dempsey Tunney 2, and it was sort of fated to happen. But nonetheless, Sharkey dominated this fight, and then Dempsey landed a low blow, and Sharkey sort of looked to the referee for, comfort. I don't know what the hell he was looking at the referee for.
Well, I think he looked at him because if you watch that fight, there's repeated low blows. I mean, Dempsey hit him low more than he hit him above the belt, I think, in this fight. And I think finally, he's getting tired of it. Sharkey, he looks at the ref, and when he looks at the ref, you've got Dempsey throws a left hook from hell and catches him not even looking and just knocks him out.
That's absolutely what happened, and it's just because the public wanted it. The public wanted Dempsey to win, and I don't think they cared whether he won fair or not. And I think I agree with you that we don't think he won fair, but he won, and then it set up, Dempsey Tunney 2. But did he really beat Sharkey in a fair way? I don't know. I don't think so, but that's the public wanted.
Now, the interesting thing I heard about Dempsey Tunney 2 was you probably heard the Al Capone stories, right?
I don't. I watch the fights. I can't really, I always have to keep careful of other people.
Historians look at newspaper clippings.
No, I look at newspaper clippings, but I have to be careful not looking at what other people write. I can look at clippings of the time, but I can't look at what other people write.
That's what we're going off of. Because Al Capone told newspaper reporters that he bet heavily on Dempsey. Bert Sugar, you remember Bert Sugar, right? Ring Magazine?
Yes.
But
yes,
Bert
big
Sugar,
cigar.
He put that in there too. He's the one that said it. And just put it like this. There's a lot of shady stuff around this time in sports. Whether it's baseball in the 1919 World Series or boxing. I mean, we know about Joe Gans losing a fixed fight, a second-round knockout. And there's just a lot of things here that so much circumstantial evidence, after a while, makes you think maybe something was true. But Capone had told Dempsey, this is what Burt Randolph Sugar said in an interview that I heard with him. He said that Capone had walked up to Dempsey and said, "I'll make sure you get more than a fair shake on this fight." And Dempsey said, "No, I want to win this fight on my own." Now, Al Capone was the guy, from what I hear, that had his own referee was going to ref the fight. But I guess the state commission found out about it, and on the morning of the fight, they pulled him from the fight and put in their own guy who would be legit. Because Capone, I guess, was friends with Davey Miller, who was going to referee the fight. And Miller and his brother had wagered heavily on Dempsey. And thinking there might be a connection, Capone bet on Dempsey also. But then the Illinois boxing officials, believing Miller might be in cahoots with Capone, replaced him with Davey Berry, who ended up being the referee. And the other one is this, and this is one that I believe from everything I've read is true, that Arnold Rothstein, again, there's that name, and former world featherweight champion Abe Attell, and if you watched the Black Sox movie from 1919, you'll know Abe Attell was one of the runners for him, worked for him, allegedly offered Tunney $1 million to throw the fight, and Tunney didn't take it. But, of course, the most controversial part here is, just like the first fight, Dempsey changed his style, but Tunney's still controlling the fight. In the seventh round, Tunney takes a big left hook, goes down to the ground. Now, the thing here is, as you talked about, Dempsey used to hover over fighters. And he's trying to hover over him, but the rules had changed, and you're supposed to go to the neutral corner before the count started. So there's probably at least 5 or 6 seconds here where there's no count because the referee's trying to get Dempsey to go to his corner. The bad thing about that is, from what I read, and this was in a newspaper account actually, was that Dempsey was the one that wanted to rule like that in this fight. And then he must have forgotten about it. So when the referee comes back and starts counting, it's already 5, 6, 7 seconds have passed.
Well, I think only about 5 seconds have passed, but I could say that Dempsey, whatever is thought people think of him, he was really a fair fighter. But I think he did forget about the rule, that a new rule that said, you can't hover over a fighter, you got to go to a neutral corner. And that you're right, for 6 rounds, he did try to change his style against Tunney, which I think is interesting. He tried, I'm not going to let this guy go at me with a distance. I'm going to keep going at him and try to enclose my fighting, though he wasn't being very effective. And then Tunney's never been down. He's only been defeated once in 73 fights, and I don't think he was, used to a guy like Dempsey who hit him really hard. And instead of Tunney kind of backing off a little bit, he stood there and took some punches and got knocked down. And there was about 5 extra seconds, but I don't think it had any influence because Tunney is clearly looking at the referee, and he's taking his count. He's saying, look, the referee makes the count, and at 9, I'm getting up, whether I get 5 extra seconds or not.
Yeah.
And then knock Dempsey down in the next round.
Yeah, I agree completely, because really it's kind of like the Buster Douglas, Mike Tyson. I think if Douglas sees 8 or 9 a few seconds early, he still gets up. And it doesn't change the fact that even after the knockdown in both of those fights, Douglas got up and continued to whip Tyson's ass, and Tunney gets up and knocks Dempsey down the next round. So I think in both those fights, the better fighter won.
And I think Muhammad Ali got knocked down 4 times, and each time he was up at the count of 2 because he said, I'm not taking any chances with referees.
Well, because the one, Jack Wapner stepped on his foot and didn't knock him down.
But technically, you're supposed to be able to look at the referee and get the count of 9, and that's what Tunney did, and that's all Tunney did.
Do you think Juan Roldan really knocked Marvin Hagler down?
Well, we're getting off course here, but anyway, I was going to say.
It's the Ollie Wepner thing all over again. Same thing, Roldan and Hagler. Hagler's only knockdown was Roldan stepped on his foot and knocked him down. It's not a knockdown. It's just bad refereeing.
What definitely though, Dempsey knocked Tunney down, and Tunney did what he's supposed to do. He waited till the count to 9. He was looking at the referee. He's completely coherent, and then at 9 he got up. And that's what you're supposed to do as a boxer. And if he got 5 extra seconds, well, that wasn't Tunney's fault. He was only looking at the referee and waiting for the count.
Yeah.
And it's controversial for the next 50 years. For the next 50 years, it was great for boxing because for the next 50 years, people debated because they liked Dempsey so much of how Dempsey was robbed because Tunney got those extra 5 seconds. Though I don't see anything that suggests to me that if you gave Tunney 5 less seconds, he was going to not get up.
Well, and the thing is this, Dempsey never said anything about it either.
No, he's a good sport, and Tunney was a good sport about
that.
Dempsey.
I think he knew he got his
They weren't
ass
enemies.
Because if you watch all 20 rounds, at least what's available,
yeah,
the only round he probably won was that round 7.
I agree. I would say Tunney won 19 out of 20 rounds, but Dempsey's one round was famous for the next 50 years. But I would say Tunney probably won 19 of those 20 rounds.
Yeah, and then we get life after boxing. He retired. He was a rich man. And then, of course, the stock market crash came. From what I saw, he lost $2-3 million there, but he fought his way back. 1935, Dempsey opened Jack Dempsey's restaurant in New York City. I think it was on 8th Avenue and 50th Street, which would be open for close to 40 years. It's where all the famous people went to hang out. I think it was right across the street from the 3rd Madison Square Garden. But when you look at Dempsey, he was a guy that, as you said, in the ring, there was a lot of questionable things that he did. Out of the ring, I don't think there was any question about the man's character.
People really liked him. You know, there's just whatever it is that people like you or they don't like you, and there's a charisma. And it's very hard to deal with charisma when the person's dead, and we're in our stage that they've been dead a long time. But there's no doubt that Jack Dempsey was so popular in his time, along with Babe Ruth, along with Lindbergh, Murderers Row. He was very popular, and he remained popular after he stopped boxing. Even more than Tunney. Tunney always remained likable, but Dempsey remained popular. I mean, really beloved.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that was big for him was the service he did during World War II. Of course, we had the World War I controversy where he did not enter. But he joined the New York State Guard, was given a commission as a first lieutenant. Later resigned that commission to accept a commission as a lieutenant in the Coast Guard Reserve. He was named a director of physical education. As part of the ongoing war effort, he made personal appearances at fights, camps, hospitals, and war bonds drives. He was promoted to lieutenant commander in December of 1942 and commander in 1944. So I think even though he didn't go into the war per se, I think the fact that he went out of his way to help with the war effort in World War II was something that had to probably quiet the rest of the naysayers about Dempsey.
Yeah, and also, you know, we don't know. Would we want to go into World War I? Was that something we wanted to jump into? He didn't want to.
Well,
it's
actually, our country
shouldn't
have, because everything I read was that war probably would have ended earlier if we wouldn't have jumped into it.
Well, then he made a good decision. Yeah. But you're right. It made him a villain for a little while, but not really, because people still went to Jack Dempsey fights to see Jack Dempsey, even if they were pretending they were mad at him. But I don't know if I'd have gone to World War I, and certainly he did what he thought he had to do as a good American in his heart, and he's beloved. He's a champ. Everywhere he goes, he's a champ, and he remains a champ, even when Joe Louis is a champ. He's a champ, you know. They're both a champ. You know, you get to hold that legacy, and Jack Dempsey held on to that fame.
Yeah, and the other thing that was interesting to me was Dempsey made friends with former opponents Wills and Tunney after retirement, with Dempsey even campaigning for Tunney's son, John V. Tunney, when he ran for the U.S. Senate in California. The thing is this, you can't find too many people that will say anything bad about him as a man. And I think that's the most important thing to take away from this. He was definitely a great fighter. Is he a top 10 heavyweight of all time, Christopher?
That I can't tell, because you can hold against his legacy 3 years of not fighting and not fighting Harry Wills, you know, a black man. But I can say that, you know, he's a beloved guy, and it was always a good sport. You know, he always would pick up his opponent when he knocked him out. He'd pick them up. He'd help them up. He was very nice how he dealt with them. And he's always nice about what he said about them. Tunney and Dempsey had nothing to say but nice things to each other. If you want to hold anything against Dempsey, he went 3 years as a heavyweight champion without fighting, and he didn't fight a black heavyweight. And you can decide how you want to hold that against him.
Yeah, and I think all sports are tainted probably before 1940 or so, just because of the lack of the best competition being available. If you look at it, Babe Ruth was a great player, but does Babe Ruth hit 60 home runs if you've got the best black players playing? Now, from looking at the record,
pitchers. I know what you mean.
From looking at the record of, I think he played like 35 games against black all-star teams and batted like 600 and hit home runs out the ass. So yeah, he probably would have, but maybe it wouldn't have been quite so much. But I think all these guys can be doubted a little bit just because of that. And the biggest problem I have here is Dempsey was so big at that time. Even if Tex Rickard didn't want him to fight Harry Wills, I'm pretty sure that if Jack Dempsey said, I'm fighting Harry Wills, he'd have been fighting Harry Wills.
I think so. I don't think Dempsey, held away because of any fright. He certainly didn't. He didn't claim any kind of racial anything like John L. Sullivan did. And he fought when they thought Tunney was the guy he should face. That's who he faced, and he's just bringing an extraordinary amount of people to the ring, and you have that kind of fame and popularity that's just unfathomable. And I don't think he avoided anybody, but then in the end he didn't fight him. And he avoided him. He avoided him.
Come on, he was the mandatory challenger. They made him fight.
Well, it was.
Hey, put it like this: if he would have thought. If he would have thought that Wills was an easier fight than Tunney, he'd have fought Wills.
And he went 3 years not fighting anybody. And a lot of heavyweight champions do that, and that's very frustrating when they just hold on to the crown and they don't fight anybody. And then Dempsey was also trying to portray that he was a completely different person than what you think. He's not a thug. He's a gentleman. He can get classy girls too, just like anybody else. He's portraying as a movie star. He's portraying all kinds of things. But you're right. You can hold that against him, that he didn't fight Wills, and he didn't fight for 3 years, and held on to the crown.
Well, and the thing is this. The sad thing about all that is this. If he fights Harry Wills in 1926 or 27, he probably beats Wills, because Wills was at the end of his career by then. I mean, Wills had probably seen his better days by 1921 or 22.
I think that's a great thing you're saying, Mike, because I absolutely agree with you that there's an irony involved, but Dempsey has to face it. But nonetheless, after he fought Firpo, he was still at the peak of his talent, and then he wasn't at the peak of his talent 3 years later. And if he had fought at the peak of his talent against Harry Wills, he probably beats him, but he didn't. And so then, you have to make decisions of where you put him.
Yeah, because Harry Wills, to me, his prime is probably, 1915 through 1920?
Or nothing else.
1914,
Dempsey,
something like that.
Dempsey's going to come out and just wail away and throw punches, because that's what Dempsey does, and that's what the public loves. And he couldn't do that against Tunney. 3 years later, not fighting, he just couldn't go out there and just knock somebody around like that. So you don't know. But you're right. If he fought him in 1924, that's Dempsey at his peak, and that's what you think Dempsey would do really well.
Yeah, but I do think this. I don't think he would have ever beaten Tunney. I mean, that going out and just wailing, I don't think that's going to beat Gene Tunney. I mean, Gene Tunney was a really good boxer, and I think no matter when they fight, Gene Tunney's just better than Jack Dempsey, style-wise.
Exactly. Styles make fights, and Dempsey is wonderful for what he did to boxing, but Tunney was the wrong guy for him, because Tunney, I agree, that if they had fought in 1924, he's not going to knock out Tunney in 2 rounds or something like that. Tunney is still going to give him, he's going to box and back off and learn what he learned from Mike Gibbons and the Gibbons brothers, and he's going to give Dempsey problems, because Dempsey can't knock him out. He might be able to win by decision, maybe, but I don't know.
Yeah, that's kind of my point, because Gibbons was a really good fighter, but he was nothing like Tunney, and Gibbons gave him trouble, went the distance with him. And that was when he would have been in his prime.
Absolutely. The defensive fighters, both Gibbons brothers, and Gene Tunney said, and he wrote in his memoirs, and he said nice things about Jack Dempsey in his memoirs, but he also said that, I learned everything I had to learn from Mike Gibbons, and his brother, was a good fighter too, but I learned more from his brother, and that's how I learned to fight Jack Dempsey.
Well, see, the other thing I saw about that was Gene Tunney, in one of his biographies, he was actually on the undercard at Boyle's 30 Acres for the Dempsey-Carpentier fight. and actually sat ringside and watched the fight and told everybody when the fight was over that he would beat Jack Dempsey because Jack Dempsey was a sucker for a right hook.
And you're right. That's one of the things, actually, we don't get a chance to talk much about, is that nowadays everybody can watch film on the other boxer, and they can just watch whatever they want to watch and learn from that. And you don't get that back then, but Tunney did watch Dempsey fight, and he knew, I'm watching him fight, and I'm picturing myself fighting this guy and what I'm going to do if I get in the ring with him.
Yeah.
Which is unusual in its time.
All right, so Chris, that was fun again. You need to do some more reading now.
Well, I can't read the other what writers write. What I can write is the newspaper clippings, but I can't read what another
I'm just talking
writes.
about newspaper clippings or people that were directly there. That's why the Doc Kearns thing, I think he was full of crap, but I think he was doing it to just get in Sports Illustrated to maybe make some money. But I just brought it up because of that. Not that I believed him. But I do think that when you kind of put 2 and 2 together, that there might have been some stuff going on there that wasn't on the up and up. But we don't know that for sure. And let's face it, Jess Willard wasn't that good. I mean, when he fought Jack Johnson,
big guy.
When he fought Jack Johnson, they put him in 107-degree heat. He basically could take a good punch. So he took punches for 25 rounds and then knocked Johnson out when Johnson wore out.
But I will say this, just for whatever it is, that whatever Dempsey and Babe Ruth brought to sports, we have not seen in our lifetime.
Red Grange also.
Muhammad Ali is the closest in our lifetime.
If it wasn't for Red Grange, there would be no NFL. The NFL was almost dead until George Halas paid him out the ass to come out of the University of Illinois and play for the Bears. And when he played for the Bears, they went on a tour all around the country, and they're selling out 80,000-seat stadiums to see him. So I think Red Grange gets shortchanged with that. But to me, Grange is the reason the NFL is so big. Dempsey's boxing, Babe Ruth's baseball.
Yeah, I'm not trying to put down Red Grange. And Lindbergh's flight in 1927, only in 1927, I can only say that Dempsey and Ruth and Lindbergh and Red Grange, they had a kind of popularity that we can't identify with today because of our social media, and that there's so many people famous, and there weren't a lot of people famous then.
Well, and you know why that
really
is? Because in 1927, for the most part, these people were immortalized even though they were still alive. You couldn't see them, except for some black and white film here or there.
No,
so what you had was these great writers like Grantland Rice that would write these mythical tales of these amazing things that these people could do, and that's what made them legends. I mean, it's harder to be a legend today because you can see everybody's warts.
Absolutely. I love that you said that because I love Grantland Rice. And you're right. I still can't quite picture the Carpentier 2 punches on Dempsey in the second round that made so many people write so many words of how important it was to the underdog in life. But they did. And at that time, sports writing was so important. And now somebody writes something in the New York Times, who cares, or the Boston Globe, who cares?
Yeah, unless it's on thegruelingtruth.net, nobody cares.
Then we care. If it's on the Grueling Truth, you people better read it, man. We're telling the truth.
All right, guys, we're going to wrap it up next week. We're going to talk about Sonny Liston, the career of Sonny Liston with Christopher Shelton, which bores me, but we'll find out something. There's a lot of mob stuff we can talk about and stuff. And then, of course, you got the Lewiston Maine Punch and all that good stuff. So I want to remind everybody that tonight at 9 o'clock Eastern, we'll have our first Super Bowl show, which will be with Mark Edwards, former New England Patriot, played in Super Bowl 36. We'll be interviewing him all week on the Grueling Truth Super Bowl week, 9 o'clock Eastern every night. We'll have a different guest, talk about a different Super Bowl. Thursday night, we'll have our NFL Pick'em show where myself, former Carolina Panther Tony Pike, former Denver Bronco Mark Cooper, and, of course, Brian Schmidt, Man and Scavenge, will all come on and pick the game for you, so make sure you check that out also. Make sure you download our app at the iTunes Store, and you can hear us on Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, iTunes, TuneIn, Google Music, wherever you hear sports podcasts, you'll find The Grueling Truth. So for Christopher Shelton, I'm Mike Goodpaster. You've been listening to The Grueling Truth. where the legends speak.